All right, we are recording. I'll go ahead and do announcements. This is really important for people who are worried about not passing the class. So the last person to take the newest exam 3, the last person who's going to take it is taking it today, which means this is your last chance to retake exams 1 and 2. Anybody who needs to retake the first 2 exams, now's your last chance, because after today, you won't be able to do it again. If you haven't done it, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but the life of me, I don't understand how there's people failing who haven't retaken the first 2 exams. To remind you, even if you get a lower score on the retake, we'll just keep your higher scores. You have nothing to lose. So retake the first 2 exams if you want. What else for announcements? Again, we're not going to meet for lab this week, or technically we're not going to meet for lab at all for the rest of the semester, even though you do have a lab to do this week and a lab to do on the last week of class. What else for announcements? Attendance, as usual, if you're online right now, make sure you send the words by 9 a.m. Everyone seems to be doing good for that. Today, I'm implementing a new thing for those of you in person, because I notice a lot of times when I'm talking, people have the face on the screen, and I'll say, hey, if you send me this word, you get extra credit, and maybe like half the class does it. So from now on, and you don't have to do this, but if you're in person, you can also send me the keywords at the end of the class. And if you the more you get, the more attendance keywords you get, the more extra credit you get for your attendance. Because I know, again, I can tell some people aren't paying attention, but I can make you be here. I can't make you pay attention. So there's a little bit more incentive to pay attention to the words that are coming out of my mouth. So are there any questions? All right, let's see if we can finish up chapter 19 today. It's a big stretch, but we'll see what we can do. The last thing we talked about was integrated pest management. We started it, but we didn't finish it. Go ahead and start. Oops. Sorry, let me get the right screen up here for myself. Yeah, anyway. So we started it, but we didn't finish it. Anyway, before we jump back into it, I'll go ahead and give you the first word for attendance. Circle it. Right there it is. Again, if you're in person and feel like sending me all these words at the end, we get a little extra credit for it. Anyway, let's jump back into it. I'm going to try to remind you of what we said. The first slide was basically saying, okay, why is this even important to us? What do we care about integrated pest management? Your book talks about how, not dangerous, but like how having a field of any crop, you're going to have a lot of pests. So we talked about that. We talked a little bit about like the relationship or the similarities between crop pests and invasive species. Like, for example, they both have opportunistic life histories. Then your book went and gave a specific example of the boll weevil, which is a great example. And I didn't say this the first time I mentioned it, but I thought about it when I was going through the video again last night. Boll weevils are a great example because they only eat cotton, right? So imagine a boll weevil in nature, right? In nature, there's not many cotton plants growing out there. Anywhere you go, usually you're going to see plants kind of separated from each other, right? And with other plants around. But when you go to a farm, some places growing a specific crop, like cotton, what you see is just rows and rows and rows of cotton, or whatever crop it is. So if you're a thing that eats cotton, like this boll weevil here, then that's a great place for you to be, right? Because there's a ton of it. That's all it is. Like the only thing you eat, that's all there is, as far as your eyes can see. And they're all close together. So again, that's why crop pests can be such a problem. All right, and I think this is where we left off. Like, how do we get rid of crop pests? I didn't ask you this because I was kind of rushing at the end, but if someone said to you, and you weren't in this class, sitting in this class right now, and someone asked you, say, hey, I've got this little garden going in my backyard, and I'm having problems with insects that are eating my plants. What would you guys recommend to them? This is what if I wasn't asking you this in biology class, and it was just your buddy saying, hey, I've got pests in my backyard. What should I do? That's what I would say, right? Yes, probably. Or you could even say, just call the pest control company. What are they going to do? They're going to spray pesticides. But your book does a great job of pointing out that pesticides aren't perfect. For one reason, it might result in populations that are not affected by the pesticide. So we talked about that when we talked about natural selection. That was a great example of natural selection in action, like natural selection that we're currently seeing. Because to remind you what we talked about with that example, you spray a field, you spray the crops with this pesticide, you kill almost all the pests that you're trying to kill, but some of them have some sort of mutation, so they're allowed to survive it. And then therefore, the ones that survive, those are the ones that mate. And then, as generations and generations go on, eventually you have this new population of pests who are no longer affected by your pesticide, right? Because of natural selection, you kind of push that along. The other thing is this, the second bullet point. Pesticides kill the natural predators too. So, I don't know, I should look this up, and you can look it up if you want for independent work, even though it's not that important. But going back to the boll weevil as an example, yeah, you want to kill them, but I'm sure it has natural predators, right? So if you just spray pesticides, yeah, you'll kill some of the boll weevils, but you're also going to kill the things to kill those boll weevils. We already talked about this first one. And then the third one here, the other reason pesticides may be bad, and this is just scratching the surface. There's many reasons, many problems that we can have with pesticides, but this is just what we're talking about. And the third one is that pesticides can also kill pollinators, right? So you need things like bees and butterflies, for example, right? Because without pollinators, without something bringing the pollen from one plant to another, or even if it's on the same plant, from one part to the other, without that, you're not going to have the fruit or the vegetable or whatever it is you're growing. So this isn't just some tree-hugging hippie stuff, right? Without this stuff, we would die, right? Without the crops, without food, we would starve to death. So, again, yes, you would use a little bit of pesticides, like she said, and like I said, that would be my first piece of advice, spray some pesticides. But again, pesticides aren't perfect. Another thing that's not even mentioned on there, and I'm looking at it, is, actually, we won't even move into that. That's good enough. So, integrated pest management uses a combination, right? So IPM, integrated pest management, we're not just saying, all right, don't use pesticides. We're kind of using you would kind of use a mixture of things. So you would use a little bit of chemical, so pesticides. You would use biological control, which is what we talked about right before this section. The examples we gave were some leaf beetle that ate the invasive St. John's wort, and what was the other example? The mongoose, that was a bad example, but the mongoose that ate the rats that also ended up eating a bunch of other things. But anyway, again, for the exam, you need to know what integrated pest management is. And then in a nutshell, it's using a combination of things. That's hopefully the word integrated can help you remember that. Integrated, as in we're integrating a bunch of different methods. So biological, again, using something alive to kill something else alive. Chemical, again, pesticides. And then something different would be called cultural. We never really talked about that. When we're talking about cultural methods, let's talk about that on this slide. First of all, tolerating low levels of pests. So if you're okay with a little bit of pests, you're not just trying to totally eradicate them, but that would be a cultural thing, right? By cultural, that means it's a decision you're making, right? You're doing things differently. Another thing would be lowering the carrying capacity. So again, I'm using the boll weevil as an example because it only needs cotton. So if you have a field of cotton every year, it's just a great place for the boll weevil to be, right? Just so much food, so close together, every year, reliable. However, there's some things you can do to lower the carrying capacity. First of all, you can use pest-resistant varieties of crops. A lot of times that comes with GMOs, and I don't really have time to talk about that right now. But another thing you can do is use mixed species of plantings. So instead of having a field of nothing but cotton, maybe break it up a little bit. Maybe have some cotton here, some corn here, some soybeans there, some peanuts there, whatever it may be. That way, you don't have like this big field that all the boll weevils could eat, right? There wouldn't be all that food for them. It would be broken up. Likewise, another thing you can do on that same note would be crop rotation. Right? So yes, you still might have a whole big field of cotton, but then the next year when the boll weevils come back, you don't have cotton anymore, you have soy. So all the boll weevils die off, and then you have new pests come along that eat soy. And then they die off because the next year you do corn. Does that make sense? You just change things up. And biological control is also used when possible. For example, on this next slide, I'm going to show you, but then I'll come back to this slide for examples or for questions. But there's a good example. Ladybugs are good for this. People will buy ladybugs, especially the people who have greenhouses, because these things are aphids. They're a crop pest, but ladybugs will eat them. So anyway, we'll move back here. I'll put it next to this, definitely next to this, because I'm not going to go through that much detail. If anything, again, I'm going to back up one more time. If anything for the exam, you need to understand that this one right here, integrated pest management uses a combination of biological, chemical, and cultural methods. So just know what biological, chemical, and cultural are. And that's it. So any questions about integrated pest management?
Could you go back to that?
Yep, this one?
Yeah.
Yep. And if for independent work, you could, look up some specifics. Like specifically, what kind of chemicals are used? We're talking, what kind of pesticides? If we're talking about integrated pest management. If we're talking about biological control, what else can you use? Like we talked about ladybug fruit. What else could be used? Cultural methods. So we talked about crop rotations and mixed field planting and not aiming for total eradication of pests. What else could you use for cultural methods? Of course, for all of you guys, or I would assume all of you guys, it probably doesn't matter much because you're not biology majors. So I doubt you're going to be out here. Or how many of you plan on owning a farm later? Okay. Oh, you do? Oh, so this might be good for you. All right. So this might be actually useful for the rest of you. This is all a purely academic exercise. Speaking of which, if you guys are interested, I could give you some information. There's something called the 1891 Scholarship, and you think of it as a STEM thing because it is based on agriculture, but there's also a business aspect of it. Anyway, they have like millions of dollars to give away and not a lot of students, and basically you get a free ride in state. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I give you some information. Anywho, if there's no questions, the next word for attendance is going to be wing, since this thing's spreading its wings as it comes in for the attack. So no questions. Let's talk about something a little bit more relevant. This is something that is affecting all of us and that will affect all of us. Just the other day, like I said, I think it was from Sunday to Monday night as I was asleep because I was seriously sucked. I wanted to see the clock turn over. But just a few days ago, we actually hit 8 billion people. We have 8 billion people on Earth now. So anyway, let's talk about what your book says. In the few seconds it takes me to read this sentence, approximately 21 people will be born somewhere in the world and 9 will die. I wish I could pull up my little screen. I'll give you guys the website that I'm talking about that actually shows it, the clock basically ticking as people, it shows the number go up and down as more people are born and more people die. But yeah, at the time this was published, it would take you to get about 21 people born for however long it took to write that or read that sentence. But now I'm sure it's a little bit different because the number expands, and we'll talk about why here in a second. What are the causes of population growth? You should know this for the exam, even though you probably already do. It's very, very simple. It's common sense. It's an imbalance between births and deaths, right? That's the cause of population growth. So if you have more births than deaths, then your population is growing. If you have more deaths than births, population is declining. You have the same number of births and deaths, and you just stick with the same number. So if we could somehow just magically get to the point where we have a balance, which we don't, we have a growth right now, that means from now on we would have 8 billion people, right? That's a lot of people. But again, that's not the situation because we still have population growth happening on Earth. Anyway, so yeah, definitely know that bullet point. This is good to know, but there won't be a test question on it. The human population is expected to continue increasing for at least the next several decades. So what we project is that eventually we will get to this point where things are balanced, where we have this, replacement rate. So births equal deaths, therefore the population is really not growing anymore, which isn't a bad thing. There's a lot of people who think, they don't think about things from an environmental perspective. They think about things as maybe, from an economic perspective. Say, we need a lot of people. But keep in mind, even when growth hits zero, that doesn't mean the human population hits zero. That means whatever number we're at, that's where it's staying. So again, if growth rate hits zero right now, we would have 8 billion people on Earth, give or take, forever. Well, until we all die off, but that's a different story. So yeah, that kind of goes into this bullet point. I was kind of already hinting at that. So even though we do have a growth rate, we expect that growth rate to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The growth rate, not the population, but the growth rate is supposed to get smaller and smaller. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click and watch that little short, that 11-minute video about growth rates. So here's a good example. You can see this was written at a time, what year is that? It's hard to tell, but it projects out to 2050. Right, and obviously this was published before current times. So right now we're probably, more around this area. So you can see, well, yeah, let's talk about this. I want you guys, if you guys are thinkers, hopefully this is, unless you're really, really good at this stuff, hopefully this is confusing you a little bit. Because here we have the total population, right? That is increasing, and it's projected to keep increasing. And then these bars represent the average annual increase. So hopefully you might be thinking, unless you just get it right away, these bars are getting smaller and smaller, right? And they're projected to keep getting smaller. So we're projected, again, to have a smaller average annual increase every year. Yet, even as it already has started going, not even just the projected, but even as it started going down since like 1980 something maybe, even though it's going down, the population is still going up. Can anybody explain that? How is that happening?
I think it's because of the massive jump from like 1950 to the next.
Basically, yeah, because it's so big here. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Another way you can look at it, and I think this is a good way to think about it, because it's very simple. Think about this in terms of money. This red line represents the total, and just obviously we're not talking about 1500 to 2050 because none of us are that old and will never be that old. Whatever time frame you want to think about this is how much money is in your bank account, right? You do it, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. And these bars are the average annual increase, as in how much money you're depositing every year, right? Does that make sense? The bars represent how much money you put in every year. So here you started off only putting a little bit in, therefore you don't have that much money in the bank. Then you start putting more and more and more in, so your money gets higher and higher. And here, that was your peak, whatever it is. And then here you put in less the next year. And here you put in less the next year. But the point is you're still putting money in the bank. Does that make sense? So even though you're putting less money into the bank, you're still putting money into the bank. You're not spending any. So your bank account's going to keep going up. Does that make sense? So if I said, all right, last year I put $10,000 in the bank. This year I only put $8,000 in the bank. Next year I'm going to put $7,000 in the bank. And if I'm talking about an account that I'm not pulling money out of, then that account's going to keep going up. Hope that makes sense. So you're still putting, yes, we're putting less money in, but we're still putting money in. Therefore, it's going to keep increasing. And that's a very important concept because people will get scared when they think, oh, the world population growth is going down. We're adding fewer people than we used to every year, but we're still adding people. So our population is still skyrocketing.
So is there any way for the total population to stop increasing by not?
To not decrease at all? Yeah, we would. That's a great question, and it's easy to visualize here, but that's what I was saying on the previous slide, where the birth rate would have to equal the death rate. So if we were adding, if 1 million people or 100 million people were born that year, you'd have to have 100 million people die.
What if there was more deaths than births?
Then technically your population would decrease. Yeah, which also, ecologically speaking, wouldn't be a bad thing. Now there's arguments against that for, again, economic reasons and stuff like that, but as far as the environment is concerned, basically the fewer people, the better. And there's arguments against that too, but anyway, that would be for my Bio 108 class. The point here is you need to understand this graph, and hopefully you do now, right? The red line indicates the total number of people. The bars indicate how many people we're adding. So even though we're adding fewer and fewer, we are still adding. Therefore, the number is still going up. And again, we are technically probably, I don't know, we should be right here, whatever year that is. I wonder if they got the year right, but yeah, because we just hit 8 billion a couple days ago. Anyway, are there any questions about this graph? All right, so that was just the introduction to this last main bullet point. Let's actually jump into the 3 sub-bullet points, which are talking about the history of human population growth, which you just kind of saw. You saw a graph of it, but we're going to actually talk about it. And we'll talk about age structures, which we learned about earlier. And then finally, we'll talk about our ecological footprint, which you're already familiar with because you already did that lab. So, throughout most of human history, so not right now, but for most of human history, parents had a lot of kids, right? And usually that was for a reason. It's not like a lot of times they did want a bunch of kids, but also because a lot of them were not making it, right? So the death rate for children was a lot higher than it is right now. So humans were like, all right, we better have a lot of kids because they're not all going to make it. And also things were culturally different, right? Having more kids was an asset. I mean, and you might think having a lot of kids is an asset right now too. But back then, it was definitely an asset because then you could have more people to help you, you know, do the chores around the house or help work on the farm or whatever it is that your family did. It would be advantageous a lot of times to have more children. Anyway, so for the exam, what you need to know, I guess, is combine this. Throughout most of human history, the rate of increase was only slightly higher than 0. I think there's a test question on that. So when you think of human growth, human population growth, not right now, but for the most of human history, basically it's been only slightly higher than 0. We've barely been growing as a species. Because again, even though we're having a lot of offspring, even though the birth rate was high, so was the death rate. I mean, even think about life expectancy back in the day. That'd be a good question for independent work if you want to look that up. The first question you could look up is, what is life expectancy right now? And if you really want to get deep into it, you could look at life expectancy, not just for all the humans, but for humans in America versus humans in Zimbabwe versus humans in the Ukraine or whatever. You can look that up. Anyway, you can look up what's the life expectancy now and what was it 10 years ago? What was it 20 years ago? Actually, and I think this last year was the first time either in the United States or worldwide that it actually went down. It's the first time life expectancy went down in, I don't know how long, a really long time. And I think it was because of COVID. So technically, because we lost so many people with COVID, our life expectancy went down. Anyway, any questions about that pretty simple slide? All right, so that's most of human history. Let's kind of move towards current times. So what happened is we had economic developments in Europe and the US, mostly those. There were some other pockets of places where it happened. But these economic developments led to advances, specifically in nutrition. So you had fewer people dying of starvation. And also they were just healthier because not only were they not dying of starvation, but they were getting, better nutrients from the food. We had advances in sanitation, right? So we haven't always had plumbing. People haven't always been able to use the restroom and have the waste go away. People haven't always been able to just wash their hands with clean water. And of course, medical care. We know there's been huge advances in that, even in my lifetime. We've had huge changes in medical care. So because of that, you would think the death rate went down, and it did, right? So the death rate started going down because of that, but also at the same time, people started taking control of the growth rate. So yes, the death rate went down, but so did the birth rate. Eventually, not at first. Because you can see first, because of all those advances, the death rate decreased, but birth rate remained the same. So that should tell you, again, what we talked about in the slide prior was we had a slight growth, right? That's what it would look like. Very slightly above 0 was the growth rate. Sorry, it's a graph. It's supposed to be that. And that red line represents growth rate. So yeah, the growth rate slightly went up, right? But then this happened, right? At first, the death rate went way down, but culture was still the same, so we still were having a lot of babies. So that's when it starts skyrocketing at that point, right? And the rate of the growth rate increased by the beginning of the 1900s. Actually, I'm gonna put an X to that, just to indicate that I'm not gonna ask that question on the exam. I'm not gonna get that specific. And then by the mid-century, this was last century, improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and healthcare, like we said up here, also spread to the developing world, which are the places that are a little bit more poor. And that spurred a growth at a fast pace, as again, birth rates far outstrip death rates. Basically, what this whole slide is saying is, again, previously we just had really, 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 really slow population growth. Then all of a sudden we really fixed the death rate issue. People started living longer, yet birth rates stayed the same. So basically the population growth skyrocketed. Specifically, you look at specific here, the world population skyrocketed from 2 billion in 1927 to 3 billion 33 years later. I'm going to put an X to that, not because it's not good to know, but because I'm not going to ask you specifically those numbers. Like, what was the population in 1927? What was it in 33 years later? So what, 3 makes it 30, so 60. So 1960 was 3 billion. And here we are, not too long, shortly after that, now we're at 8 billion. Anyway, because of all this, because we had this skyrocketing population, and again, remember, for the longest time, it was just slowly creeping up. Now all of a sudden it's skyrocketing, therefore scientists became alarmed. And because of that, things started, we started taking control of things, and the overall growth rate peaked in 1962. Again, X did that too. I'm telling you the story, it's good to know it, but I'm not going to specifically ask you these numbers. You should just know the general trend. Again, slow population growth for most of human history, population explosion because of the death rate went down. And then finally, because of people getting alarmed and started taking control of it, it peaked eventually, specifically in 1962, and you don't necessarily need to know that number, but eventually it peaked, and then things started going, the growth rate started going down. And what happened? How did this happen? Well, developed nations, we still had the advanced medical care to improve survivorship, but we also had started getting more effective contraceptives. I think about the birth control pill. That's something you can look up for independent work. When was that born or created? So anyway, things like that, right? So again, finally, the birth rate started going down too, to match the fact that the death rate had started going down. And therefore, the overall growth rate of the world's population began a downward trend as the difference between the birth rate and the death rate decreased. The important thing here is we're talking about, focus on that growth rate. The growth rate of the world population decreased. The population has not decreased at all since then. The growth rate has decreased. Again, people in my Bio 108 class have a really hard time differentiating between the two because in their brain they hear the birth rate is decreasing, so in their brain they're just thinking population's decreasing, and it's not. It's still exploding. It's just that it's not exploding at such a high rate as it used to. Are there any questions about this slide? All right, the next word for attendance, I'll underline it and point an arrow to it. That is the next word for attendance. Anyway, if there's no questions about this slide, let's move forward. Here's a little table. This is from 2012. So again, another great or decent independent work topic. Basically, put this in paragraph form, but also instead of looking at data from 2012, get the most recent data you can. And look at the world population. What is the current world birth rate? What is the current world death rate? And then, of course, the birth rate and death rate together make up the growth rate. Same thing here. That's over the world. And you could look at more developed countries like the United States, Europe, a lot of countries in Europe. Look at their growth rate, death rate, birth rate. And then, of course, the less developed countries. So, like places like Kenya. I mean, it's not undeveloped, but the main thing about Kenya right now is they have a lot of people starving to death currently. So, anyway, just something to think about. I will put a big X to that because, again, I'm not going to ask you these questions. I'm not going to get that specific. First, most importantly, because this isn't even current data, right? So that's from 2012. So there's no need for you to memorize something that might not even be accurate anymore. So are there any questions about table 19.3? Good, let's move forward. We might be able to finish chapter 19. The next thing, we're going to talk about age structure. We've already talked about age structure in general. We just didn't talk about it in the context of human population growth. The example we gave for age structure was that bird. We saw a graph, a bar graph that showed like the distribution of the ages of the birds. Like there was a lot of them that were 4 years old. There was none of them that were 10 years old. There was none of them that were 2 years old and 3 years old. And from that age structure, I said you could go back, even if you just started studying those birds, you could say, oh, well, something must have really bad happened in 10 years ago because there's 0 birds at the age of age 10. And there was a bunch that were age 4. So again, you could say something really good must have happened for these birds 4 years ago. And then from there, you can just backtrack and look at all the data you can find, see if you can find a correlation. But that's if you're studying something else. Let's talk about age structure for humans. For us, this is important because it helps predict the population's future growth. So again, we know the growth rate Of course, the last one I just gave you was from 2012, but we do know the growth rate. And the way you figure out how many people are going to be added to the population, I guess I write it here, is you take the population number, like right now, let's call it 8 billion. You just multiply it by the growth rate. So population, I don't know if the growth rate is 1.8 right now, that's what you multiply it by. Because that's 1.8%. So technically, you would multiply the population by, another way of writing that is 0.018. Anyway, you take the population number, you multiply it by the growth rate, and that'll tell you about how many new people you will get the following year. So we can use this because not only do we know the current population growth, the population growth rate and the population number, we can then make projections. So we know right now we have 8 billion people, and we multiply that by whatever the growth rate is, we know how many people we'll have next year. And then from that number, we say, okay, that's the new number, and we'll multiply it by what we project the new population growth rate will be. You can keep multiplying. Basically, that's all we're saying, is you can use the numbers, right? The current population growth rate and the current population growth or population number, multiply it and keep making future predictions, which is important. None of you are biologists, but this would be important for, I don't know, any of you criminal justice majors? No? Anybody doing anything with business? You, all right, see, business, right? So you can look at this and make projections. If you look at in 1989, what we see here is that, where are we looking at, Mexico? I think it's Mexico. The place doesn't matter. But back in 1989, what this thing shows is there was a lot of young people and very fewer old people, right? And then in 2012, it's kind of evening out. So all those young, really young people grew up, right? And now they're a little bit older, but there's still, now we don't have a lot more young people. So now we have about the same number of young people and middle-aged people, and then much fewer old people. And then we projected what it should be in 2035. Now, all the way from like young to old, right? It's about the same number of people. And again, if you're in a business, that would be important because, you know, you're looking at business, old people, young people, middle-aged people, they buy different things. You advertise differently to them, stuff like that. If you're a criminal justice major, you know, a lot of times these people commit different crimes than these people who commit different crimes than these people. You know, I would assume there's trends among age in stuff the crimes they commit. Any political science majors? No, okay, because that would also be important, right? So if you're looking at infrastructure, like, you can see here we need a lot of schools, right? Because we have a lot of young people. Here we can say, look, there's very few old people here. Here, there's projected to be a lot more old people here than here. So again, if you're in the political science, well, we need to start working on our infrastructure for that. We're going to need to spend maybe less money on education and more money towards things like Social Security, and, you know, things that will support older people. Anyway, long story short, that's what the age structures are used for. Basically, we can predict what the future will be using these age structures. And that brings us to a term that you need to know for the exam, which is population momentum. And that is the continued growth that occurs after the high fertility rate is reduced to replacement rate. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, she was asking, you know, at what point does the population stop growing? And that would be at that point, right? When you have replacement rate, when birth rates equal death rates. But even then, again, you have population momentum. So even though the growth rate is not up anymore, you still have so many people that it's going to continue to do that, right? And that's the most important part. Let me put a circle around there. That's the most important part for the exam. You need to know what population momentum is. And then to explain what causes it, not that I'm going to ask you, but this growth rate, or this replacement rate, this continued growth, the population momentum is a result of girls who used to be from the ages of 0 to 14, surpassing that and reaching childbearing years, right? So, again, basically, going back to this, the reason we have this population momentum where we're just getting older and older people, right? So you can see the overall population here, it's about the same, right? It's about the same. But what we're saying is once these young people get old enough to have children, That's why the population still keeps growing or maintains its size, because we still, even though our population growth rate is evening out, we're still having people coming up to childbearing years. So therefore, we're still adding to the population, just not at a rate higher than the death rate. So again, the most important thing here for population momentum is you understand that there's still continued growth rate after the high fertility rate is reduced to replacement rate. Yeah. Any other questions? Download the PowerPoint. You can click on this link and watch a really, really quick video about population momentum. It does a great job of explaining it with graphics, better than I could do. And I've already talked about this, so this would be a really quick review. But age structure diagrams indicate social conditions. So like I was saying earlier, if you're into political science or business, you need to understand, like if you're looking at the age structure, do we need to put more money towards schools? Like if we have a lot of young people, do we need to emphasize more on employment? So if we have more middle-aged people and adults, infrastructure, again, all this stuff. Not that I'm gonna test you on that. Just a big old X. Again, my point is, whether you're a business major or a political science major or a criminal justice major or whatever, this age structure is actually important to your everyday life. And then the next slide just shows you basically what we looked at before, except now it's in the United States. Yeah, so the last one we looked at was the Mexican age structure, and this is the the United States of America age structure. Nothing you need to know. That's just an example, so I'll put a big X through this as well. All right, so are there any questions about age structures? That brings us to the last portion, which we should be able to go through pretty quickly because hopefully you've all done the lab, and the lab did a really good job of really showing you at least your own ecological footprint. And the pre-lab did a really good job of explaining what the ecological footprint is. But let's talk about it anyway. The U.S. Census Bureau projects a global population of 8 billion within 10 years. So again, I think this was published in 2016, I think. I'm not positive, but I think this book was published in 2016. So they meant, as of a couple of days ago, they were correct. We did hit 8 billion. They also say that by 2050, it should be 9.6 million. I'm going to put an X to this, not because it's not important, but because I'm not going to ask you the specific numbers on the exam. So the question is, do we have sufficient resources to sustain 8 or 9 billion people?
No.
Right? And the answer is no. As you should know from the lab, what's a good example? The Earth overshoot day, right? That means, once whatever date that was, at that date, that means everybody on Earth as a whole used everything that the Earth could produce in a year. So the date on the lab was like August. So that means by August, we've used everything that the Earth would produce in an entire year. Meaning, if we keep that up, we will eventually run out of resources. It's almost like saying, all right, you have a really big old bank account, millions of dollars in your bank account. But now what's happening is you're starting to spend more than that's going in, which doesn't mean you're all going to be out of money right away, right? But over time, if you keep spending more per year than you're making, then that means you're digging into your reserves, you're digging into your savings, and eventually you're going to run out. And that's what we're saying here. So yeah, it might not be like, oh, we're all going to die by 2050. The point is, and some people will say that though, some people are alarmists. But the point is, even if it's not like death is going to come to our doorsteps tomorrow, the point is it is an issue that needs to be at least addressed or considered. Anyway, your book says that the world food production has to increase, obviously to accommodate people expected to live in the coming decades. And also, as I just mentioned, for example, there's people starving to death in Kenya right now. We want to improve the diets of the currently malnourished. So anyway, I just put a big old X to this slide. Because again, this is important, just because as far as the exam is concerned, I'm not going to ask any of these questions. This is just an introduction into this topic of ecological footprints. Let's say the next word for attendance, water. Anyway, and again, I'll put a big old X to this because I'm just not going to ask this question, but it is important in the grand scheme of things. So not only do we have a rising increase in population, but our agricultural lands are already under pressure, right? Even at the level that we're at, we're under pressure. Why? Well, we have all kinds of reasons why. We have overgrazing, so we have livestock that are eating too much, and that turns grassland into desert. And a lot of times that's irreversible. Therefore, once it's in the desert, you're just done. That's land that you can no longer use. Water usage is up. It's gone up 6 times in the past 70 years. There's been changes in precipitation rates. A lot of that has to do with climate change, and that has caused food shortages in certain places, which is interesting because, places like America, we have too much food for a lot of people, right? So obesity is an epidemic here. Meanwhile, in other places in the world, starvation is an epidemic. And also, because so much open space is needed to support the expanding population, other species are expected to become extinct. So basically, as the human population grows, and we need more room just for us, but we also need room for our agricultural lands, and we need room for where we gather our water and where we dump our waste, right? So we're taking up space. That's obviously a bad thing. Any questions about that side before we get into some stuff that you actually need to know for the exam? Okay, you already know this, but you need to know for the exam. What is your ecological footprint? It is the estimated area of land and water. You know what, this will make it even easier for you. Estimated area, there we go, required to provide resources an individual or a nation or even the world consumes. So basically, how much space do we need to live, right? That's why I got rid of land and water, because also, even though it doesn't really take up space, it's worth considering, a lot of our byproducts are air pollution, right? So we're putting in carbon dioxide into the air, putting in things that are destroying the ozone, things like that. And again, it could be looked at as an individual basis, because that's what you calculated. You calculated using that on that lab, you calculated your ecological footprint. And then you were instructed to, and hopefully you actually did this and weren't lost in the details, but you were supposed to look at your ecological footprint and compare that to the United States. Like, how do you compare to the average person in the United States? How does that compare to the average person in the world, right? Then your book gets pretty specific. I'm going to put it next to this only because I'm not going to ask these specific questions. But if we're talking about needing area, right? What do we need area for? What do we need land and water and also air for? We need it for food, fuel, housing, the ability to absorb waste, right? So land, sewer treatment plant, landfill, things like that. So if we compare our resources with Earth's capacity to renew resources, which is called biocapacity, and I'm going to underline that because you need to know what biocapacity is. It is Earth's capacity to renew resources. So again, if we compare our biocapacity with our ecological footprint, that gives us a broad view of the sustainability of human activities. Again, you did this all in the lab. You took your biocapacity, your ecological footprint, and you compared it to the biocapacity of the Earth, and also maybe even the biocapacity of the United States in general, and compared. As you should remember from the lab, on average, Americans use more than we produce, ecologically speaking. And that's not sustainable, right? If you keep using more than that's getting produced, you're going to run out of stuff. You're going to run out of fish. You're going to run out of other food. You're going to run out of fuel. You're going to run out of places for housing. You're going to run out of places to put your waste. So it's a really big deal, I think. And again, I know some people are alarmist and they say, "Oh, the world's going to end in 20 years if we don't do something." I'm not getting that dramatic, but I'm saying eventually, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're obviously going to have a huge problem. And we're already having somewhat of a problem, but eventually it's going to get really, really bad.
Isn't it also because of with the fish in the sea, over capturing them?
Yeah, and we'll talk a lot about that in the next chapter. So yeah, a lot of the problem is, and that is this, right? That's a great example of biocapacity. You could get really specific and just instead of saying your ecological footprint in general, and the biocapacity in general, you could say the amount of fish that you eat per year, compared to the amount of fish that are born or, that are produced every year. Again, you can balance it that way. So this is just a really big way of balancing. You're balancing everything you need versus everything that's produced. And it really is a handy way of looking at things. So your book gets specific again and says that according to the World Wildlife Fund, the average ecological footprint for a person in the world was 1.5 times the planet's biocapacity per person. Meaning, if you take all the humans, some people are using a lot, some people are barely alive and barely using anything. If you take all the stuff we're using as a world population, we're using about 1.5 more resources than the planet can produce. And again, you have to think about that critically and look at the big picture. Because if you think about that too specifically, that might confuse you. So you might say, how is it that we're using more than the Earth can produce? That's impossible. But it's because for billions of years, humans haven't been around. And then when humans were around, we had a very slow population growth. So for billions of years, Earth has been producing these resources. And it's just now that we're starting to use more than it's producing, right? So again, it's like we have this huge savings account. But now, this number indicates that we are spending 1.5 times more than we are making, if we're thinking of it as a bank account, right? So we're dipping into our savings because we are spending more than we are making. Anyway, it's a good number. You can look it up. I know you used it in the lab, but that was back when this book was published. It might still be the same, but I'm not going to ask you those numbers. The point is, what you definitely need to know is, on average, the world is using, and I know this is still the case, on average, the world is using more than the Earth can produce. So this green line indicates how much the Earth can produce. This pink line represents the world average that we just talked about. And then they get specific. So you can look, so in the United States, we're consuming way more than the Earth can produce. But then if you look at the other extreme here, in Afghanistan, people are using far more food. If everybody lived like people in Afghanistan or Haiti or India, we'd be okay because we're using less than the Earth can produce. Of course, honestly, when you think about really, I don't even get into that. Never mind. So this slide kind of goes into what this next slide is saying in words instead of on a graph. Affluent nations consume a disproportionate amount of resources. So basically, what we're saying here is it's not just an issue of population size, right? It's not just how big our population is. It's the fact that the richer a country gets, the more resources they use. That's what this bullet point says. Right? The richer they become, the more resources they use. I'll put it next to this because again, these are specific numbers that I'm not going to ask you. But the richest countries make up at the time 15% of the global population. That's it. Yet, so we're saying the top 15, which we are in that, even all of us in this room, I would imagine, are in that top 15%. Yet we account for 36% of the total footprint. Right? So if everything was equal, the top 15% would represent 15% of the global footprint, but we don't. More than double that, right? 36%. Anyway, it goes back to saying, again, the problem is not just overpopulation, but overconsumption. So if everybody on Earth lived as a typical person from the United States, we would require 4 Earths to sustain us, right? And that's just not possible. Here's a picture that kind of showing you the differences, right? So I think this is supposed to be a typical kitchen in the United States versus a typical kitchen/dining room in Afghanistan. You can see they just have far fewer things. So then that says nothing about how happy they are or anything like that. Just stuff, right? They have tables and chairs and cabinets, stuff in their cabinets, and they just don't, right? They've got a dirt floor and a blanket. So again, the richer a country gets, the more resources they use. And let's say the last word for attendance will be, or I guess 2 words, blue shirt. Since that kid's wearing a blue shirt. Are there any questions about chapter 19? Great, we ended a minute early. So on Friday, we will do chapter 20. Is anybody wearing WVSU? Oh, okay. So that's it. For those of you present, if you, like I said, if you were taking notes and jotted down all those independent work, attendance words, go ahead and email them to me, and I'll give you some extra credit for that.